I started my research career many years ago as a rocket scientist, so I think that qualifies me to talk with authority on many subjects, and that's what I intend to do this morning. So, climate change, why the reluctance? For the last 6-7 years, I've been back at University College London, working with neuroscientists and psychosociologists and marketeers and narrative specialists, trying to explore why it is that this subject, which I think is central to much of your thinking here, otherwise you wouldn't be here, is so polarizing and so difficult to address, it seems, in society at large. So let's start. I trained as a physicist originally, and so from my point of view, the issue that we're dealing with is the following. This is an image of the Earth. It's a slightly unusual one. As I say, I used to work with the agencies and research groups that would develop satellites to produce these sort of images. And so this is an image of the Earth, but it's taken in the thermal infrared. And you've all seen pictures of thermal infrared images of houses leaking heat and so on. So this is an image from space of the Earth leaking heat back out into the darkness of the cosmos. Of course, what the planet is trying to do is to radiate away at exactly the same amount of energy as it's intercepting from the sun. But I checked the web yesterday, and the latest measurement of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that it's there at 408 parts per million. That's from a couple of days ago in the free air over the Pacific. And some of you may know that the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere varies as we go through ice age cycles. And the natural cycle takes us from about 180 parts per million in the ice age, the cold phase, to about 280 parts per million in the warm phase, the interglacial, which is what we're in now. So that's where it was until we discovered that we could use fossil fuels to generate energy and literally power the construction and operation of the modern world. And so in 100 years or so, we've pushed that concentration up from 280 parts per million to now 408 parts per million. So we're the first human beings to breathe that amount of carbon dioxide in the free atmosphere. And you all know the story. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas with water vapor and others. It maintains a 30-degree centigrade gradient from the surface of the Earth to the top of the atmosphere, to the layer which is emitting the radiation that you see in this image. It's a nice image because you'll notice that even in the dark areas, which is the clear atmosphere, you cannot see the surface. And that's because the atmosphere is opaque because of the presence of these greenhouse gases. So if you increase by 46%, one of the components of the atmosphere which is keeping the surface warmer than it would otherwise be, then you don't have to be a Nobel Prize winning physicist to realize that probably you will end up warming the surface. And that's, of course, exactly what's happening. So we've upset the energy balance of the planet. As we're speaking, the planet is accumulating more energy from the sun than it's radiating to space because of this additional blanket of CO2. And interestingly, the rate at which the planet is accumulating energy is 16 to 20 times greater than the total amount of energy that humans generate to run the modern world. So if by your actions you generate a consequence which is an order of magnitude greater in terms of unwanted consequences, then that would seem to be a slightly foolish and unwise thing to do. And that's really what this morning's lecture is about. We've upset the energy balance of the planet. So, as I say, the surface is warming, and there are various graphs and representations of it, but I like this one by a colleague of mine called Ed Hawkins. And what we have is essentially a clock face, except that round the circumference we have the months of the year, so January, February through to December. The inner white circle is where the temperatures of the planet were pre-industrial, so the 1850s or thereabouts. And we've also drawn on here the 1.5 degree and 2 degree guardrails, which we'll come on to again a little bit later, but which you will, I'm sure, be aware are seen as the limits beyond which it is unwise to go. in terms of the total amount of warming of the planet. And what you're going to see is an animation of temperatures throughout each year from 1850 to 2017. And you'll see them spiral outwards from that original level, which is called 0 degrees C here. Oh dear, why is that not working? Okay. Right, we had some problems this morning with my computer and it looks, there we go, it is working. Excellent, good, good, good. So here we are, not much happening in the late 19th century. We come partway through the 20th century, again, not very much happening. But as we get to the Great Acceleration, so-called, from the 1970s onwards, you see temperatures spiral outwards, nearly already breaching the 1.5 degree level during the last big El Nino event, which was a couple of years ago. I'll let it run again. So this is quite a nice demonstration of what's been happening. You know, people argue about you will find climate contrarians say, well, it's some natural cycle, the world hasn't warmed, but this, I think, rather neatly demonstrates that it has, and dramatically so. And of course, that's just the average across the planet. This map shows 2006 to 2015 relative to that original pre-industrial. And you'll see that the warming has been quite patchy across the planet, but by and large, it is amplified, particularly in the Arctic region, where we've seen as much as 3 degrees of warming. And so the average is only about 1 degree, but there are areas that have warmed much more. And this, it's important that these small shifts have a very big impact on the extremes. So the average may only shift a little, but it will have a big impact on reducing the number of extreme cold events and increasing the number of extreme warm events. So this little animation shows this rather nicely. You'll see the average shift, and you'll see that the area under the curve of extreme heat, and indeed the tail of the distribution, shift rather dramatically, even though the shift in the mean is rather small. I'll go back and do it again. So you see that the number of extreme heat events is amplified disproportionately compared with the shift in the mean. It's just it's something that, whether it's mean sea level rise and the extreme flooding events or temperature, this is always true. And so in 2003, we had a particularly extreme heat wave that ranged across Europe, but particularly impacted France. There were what the medics call euphemistically, there was a harvest of 70,000 additional deaths. Obviously, these people would have died at some point, but there was a spike in deaths due to the extreme heat, particularly in buildings, even in the hospitals. And what's interesting is that this is the area that was shown in that map. This is some modelling work that was done by a colleague of mine at the Met Office called Peter Stott. And it shows temperatures running through last century up to 2003. You see the unusual spike there for that few months in the summer. So that's the level that it reached there. But the projections, and I fully point out that these are worst case projections, but you need to look at those. The projections for the future show that this is what could be coming down the street. And what you see is that in 2045, if these projections are fulfilled, then what happened in 2003 will be an average summer period. And in 2065, it will be an unusually cool summer. Now, these are rather extreme projections. The actuality may be half this, but that doesn't change the nature of the story. It simply delays the time when this will become true. So extreme heat is certainly one of the issues that we have to take very seriously when we're looking at the future of the climate change that we've committed to and that is coming down the pipeline towards us. So we have this imbalance in the energy. Where does the energy go? Well, 70% of the surface of the planet is covered by ocean, and the ocean is dark compared with the land. So it should be no surprise that 94% of this energy imbalance is disappearing into the ocean. We don't live in the ocean. the ocean has a high heat capacity, so as you put enormous amounts of energy into it, the temperatures don't change as much as would be the case with the atmosphere. And so most of the heat is disappearing into a part of the planet that we're not directly familiar with or aware of. The remaining 6% is shared more or less equally between the land, the atmosphere, and the ice. So my research for many years was all to do with the polar regions, polar ice. Ice, of course, near the melting point, is very vulnerable to even small changes in temperature, and it will melt, it will transform itself to water. So let's just look at the area of the Arctic, which I hope you recognize here. You can see Canada, Greenland, and you can just about make out the Eurasian continent on the back there. And what's shown is the Arctic Ocean with its ice cover on it. This is from the mid-1980s. And the grading of colour shows, or of white to grey, shows in light colours the very thick ice, the ice that has survived several summers, and so is, or was, probably up to 5-6 metres thick. So a thick crust of ice isolating the ocean from the atmosphere, preventing exchanges of heat, moisture and momentum. So it acted as a sort of cap, isolating that ocean, huge ocean basin from the atmosphere. And then the lighter areas are thinner ice, and running down between Canada and Greenland, you can see some light colour. That's first-year ice. That's ice that just forms in the winter and then melts again in the summer. And there's a little histogram to the right that shows that in the winter of '84, something like 30% of the ice cover in the Arctic was this very thick, strong ice, very difficult to break up with wind and ocean currents. So I'm going to show you a fast animation running forward to a couple of years ago, and you will see this kind of heartbeat of ice growth and decay as you go through the summer and back to the winter, but you'll see something else happening, and well, I'll draw your attention to it at the end. So we're coming up to the mid-1990s, new century, 2005, 2010, 2016, and then it flicks between the two. So, and this is September, so two things have happened. Firstly, the area of the Arctic Ocean covered with any sort of ice in the summer, September is where you get the ice minimum, has reduced by 40%. So we're now seeing open ocean where we used to see ocean covered in ice. But more dramatically, the really thick ice, the strong ice that sort of bound the pack together, has reduced from about 30% down to about 5%. In fact, the thickest ice, which used to cover about 16% of the Arctic, is now down at 1%. So you will see news reports of, the Arctic ice in the summer is reduced now to the point where ships can sail through. The Koreans have built a fleet of ice-strengthened ships that, by coming across the Arctic, can cut off 7 days transport time during the summer. You don't need to have huge nuclear icebreakers breaking a path for them anymore. But more importantly, we've lost that really thick ice. So what is left is very thin, fragile ice. And there are discussions. It's quite difficult to predict ice because it's very prone to, it responds very strongly to small changes in the energy balance of the Arctic. But it looks like we'll have an ice-free Arctic in the summer, certainly sometime later this century. People argue how many decades away it will be. But what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. This has changed the whole interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere over the high-latitude northern hemisphere. That's changed the way the jet stream functions. And this is seen as one of the reasons why we're seeing these periods where very cold air spills out of the Arctic over mid-latitudes in America and Europe, and very warm air penetrates deep into the Arctic, just amplifying this process. So we're seeing very major changes in the way that the ocean and atmosphere function north of us, which are having direct consequences on the extreme weather that we experience in mid-latitudes. So as the energy accumulates, as I say, mainly in the ocean, the world warms, ice and snow melt, sea levels rise because as you warm the water in the ocean, it expands, and also ice on land in Greenland, the glaciers around the world and in the Antarctic either melt or slide into the ocean, raising its level. And sea level is rising now at a geologically significant rate. It's rising certainly at 30 centimetres a century, which is sort of that much. But over the last few years, it looks like that's accelerated even more to probably 40, 45 centimetres a century. And up until the industrial period, it had been stable for at least a couple of thousand years. During the transition from the last ice age to the present, sea level rose at about a metre per century. So we've kicked off in 100 years something that the planet does naturally on a 100,000-year time scale, and that has its consequences. The storm surges that have been hitting the east coast of the States have penetrated significantly further and done much more damage to properties and indeed assets than they would have done if they had not seen that sea level rise. Because the temperature gradient, as you saw in that map showing that the high latitudes have warmed more than the equator, that change in the temperature difference means that the thermodynamics, the driving forces of ocean and atmosphere circulation patterns are changing. A warmer atmosphere carries more water, 7% for each degree centigrade, so you get more intense rainfall when it does rain. And you also get more drying because the atmosphere can suck more moisture out of the soil. So you get changes in agriculture and so on as a consequence. Extreme weather events increase. You saw the little sliding demonstration of that. Ecosystems respond, and both marine and terrestrial ecosystems are responding very strongly. Food and water supplies are affected. Infrastructure is damaged or requires upgrading to make it more resilient. Economic and political stability are affected, and people and species are impacted. And this isn't a linear set of consequences. These consequences all interact with each other in complicated ways, and so quite difficult to predict and follow. But it's a set of consequences that one might wish we had not kicked off. And just to illustrate with a few images, these some frames: fires in Portugal, Hurricane Ophelia in Ireland, fires in California, and then the floods in Cumbria from a couple of years ago. What this illustrates is that we are imperfectly adapted even to the climate system that we inherited, because it's shifting slowly, but these events were always feasible under the system that we inherited. You see that I think it's 10,000 properties were destroyed in California in the fires just recently. There are still large numbers of homeless people who've lost everything. So the planet is indifferent to the human consequences, and it will strike anywhere. So we're imperfectly adapted to the system that we inherited, and we're certainly not adapted to the system that we're provoking. So a lot of people have been aware of this, in particular the security services and the military. So this is a report, or there was a report by the US Department of Defense in 2014, so the work was done prior to that. And in the report, they said rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. The only thing I would disagree with that statement is the will, because what we're seeing increasingly, and particularly this year, is that this is already happening. And of course, one of the indirect consequences of all of this is that it will drive increasingly very large numbers of climate refugees and migrants. And we have seen here, this is the tail end of the migrant flow across the Mediterranean and into Europe. And we have seen how destabilizing this has been to European politics. It's well understood that a major factor in the what I will call catastrophic Brexit situation is that it was driven by a fear of foreigners and a fear of free movement. And so you could argue that Europe has already suffered huge political damage as a consequence of a flow of migrants, part of which was exacerbated by the severe drought in Syria in 2007, 2010. But this is nothing to what we will see in future. So it's a threat multiplier. So that's all very gloomy, and I don't want to completely depress you to start the morning off. There are some bright elements of this, and that is that there really was a diplomatic triumph in Paris in 2015. I was there. It was an extraordinarily exhilarating moment in human history. It's a pity that it took 30 years to get to it, because we've known. Us climate scientists have known that what was going on. We predicted all of this years ago. The only thing that surprised us is that things have happened rather more quickly than we expected. But finally, 195 nations agreed that there is a problem that needs to be dealt with. And so rather than arguing about whether the nations of the world should do something, they agreed that they would do something. And so the discussion now is about what that should be. So two key results emerge from Paris. One is a common goal to hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So you saw those guardrails on that earlier graph. Interestingly, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is this massive effort on the part of the climate science community to review and synthesize what the thousands of pieces of research are telling us, much to the surprise of many of us, the recent report that's come out shows that there is a substantial difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. It makes a difference of probably 10 centimeters in sea level rise in the long run, and far reduces or significantly reduces impacts and costs. So that 1.5 degrees, which was rather a surprise outcome of Paris, turns out to be quite important. But it's all very well having a goal, but you need to have a plan. And so the collective plan is to cut anthropogenic emissions and to achieve a balance with removals by sinks in the second half of the 21st century. And indeed, the nations of the world put on the table a series of voluntary plans, individual nation attempts to reduce their emissions, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So that's the first bit of good news, that the nations of the world, truth has spoken to power, power has finally responded, and this is unprecedented. I don't think there's ever been an occasion in human history where essentially the leaders of the vast percentage of humanity have all agreed that something needs to be done and committed themselves to doing it. Now, at one point in my career, I ran the Science Museum in South Kensington, and one of the privileges of being the director is that you can go and look at the reserve collection, which is 96% of the collection, kind of potter around, look at the 30 kilometers of technical journals that are kept in the archives and library. And you soon come to the conclusion that on an otherwise finite planet, human ingenuity genuinely is unbounded. That small percentage of humanity who think of things and create things and generate the kind of technology that we've come to more or less take for granted in the modern world, they're hugly productive. And given the backing, given the funding and the capacity to do so, can and will provide extraordinary technological innovation that can help us deal with this. But of course, that needs to be supported. Individual entrepreneurs struggle to change the world on their own. And so one other outcome of the Paris Accord, or the Paris discussions, which is possibly less well known, is that the 23 nations and the European Union agreed to participate in a program called Mission Innovation, which is an attempt to provide the wherewithal to allow those entrepreneurs, those inventors, those technology specialists to deliver clean green energy and a variety of other techno fixes that will certainly not solve the climate problem, but will certainly make great inroads into it. And that seems to be moving forward. There are individual entrepreneurs, Bill Gates and so on, are involved. And one can hope that that manages to accelerate progress in the way that they intend. And we see everywhere. This is a solar farm in France that delivers enough energy for 3,000 homes. These are the mega wind turbines, 32 of them deployed off the coast of Liverpool. The amount of energy that a wind turbine can generate goes up as the square of the length of the turbine blades. These turbine blades are 80 meters long, so each one produces 8 megawatts of power. And what's important, I'll come on to in a second. But anyway, so the UK is a world leader in offshore wind. Onshore wind is still by far the cheapest way of delivering power in the UK. And that has struggled because of objections from people who don't like to see wind turbines on their skyline. But gradually, UK energy policy now seems to be overcoming that. And of course, the other good news is that China and of course India, but China in particular, has partly for air pollution problems, but also to ensure their commercial success in the world, have taken a deliberate policy to become world leaders in solar PV. They've set themselves a target of 20% renewables by 2030, which they will certainly exceed. And if that doesn't sound too much, that's equivalent to the entire US baseload generating capacity, and they're well on track to deliver that. And of course, what's interesting is just like Moore's law has increased the capability of computers year on year on year over decades now, the cost of solar and wind have been plummeting far beyond what anybody predicted, even the most optimistic. And batteries are doing the same, to the point, so you can see those curves tumbling so many % per year, and there seems to be no tail off of that. But here's one projection of what power costs could look like in just 12 years away. And you'll see that solar, the renewables world, is coming in at around $20 per megawatt hour. And everything else, biomass, coal, nuclear, far higher than that. And of course, that's crucial, because as soon as the markets see that that's true, and it's happening already, then those that are already in the fossil fuel industry recognize that the end of fossil fuels is coming, will quickly be pushed aside. So the markets will just drive the penetration of renewables into the energy market. If we begin to see anything like exponential growth, which is what this would imply will happen, then that is extremely good news. And we might very well come close to meeting the target set in Paris. Now, of course, energy is where we've seen already substantial progress, but this is an old diagram. McKinsey produced these abatement option curves probably a decade or so ago. And so what you're looking at here is as you go from left to right, you're moving across the full rate of carbon dioxide emissions by humanity. So the total is roughly 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And each one of the vertical lines is an intervention of some sort that will reduce that amount of CO2 emissions. So if you did everything, then you would reduce human CO2 emissions to zero. And the lines that go below the curve save you money, and the lines that go above the curve cost you money. And so what's fascinating is that the first third of human carbon dioxide emissions could be abated, could be removed by actions that in the end save individuals, companies, and humanity money. The other 2/3 increasingly cost you more money. So that, for example, the most expensive shown on here is carbon capture and storage on the right, iron and steel carbon capture and storage. I should say that these you shouldn't take any one of these bars too seriously. Individual economists and specialists have looked at each one and argued about how reliable they are. It's just a general picture that's important and remains true. And in this set of options that allow you to make money by reducing emissions, building efficiency in new build, and retrofit of residential heating, ventilation and air conditioning are two that stand out. And indeed, the one that gets you the biggest benefit per dollar invested or euro invested is residential appliances. So for this audience, that is surely an important indicator. So we had bad news, we had some good news, and now we've got a little bit more bad news. We're never short of reports. It's difficult to keep up with the reports that kind of fly around the internet. So a month or so ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its Global Warming of 1.5 degrees C report, which, as I said, shows that 1.5 degrees is really a lot better than 2 degrees. Shell published their Sky scenario, which shows that the physics, chemistry and biology still would just allow us to scrape home at about 1.5 degrees or thereabouts. But the problem is with humanity and society, whether we actually have not only the willpower, but the capacity, the institutions in order to fulfill that. And then another report came out from the UK's climate expert panel that advises, the independent panel that advises the government on the Climate Change Act and our carbon trajectories. And these two say we are perilously close to running out of time. We've been saying that for, 30 years, but it's really true now. If we really don't accelerate the scale and pace of intervention, then the 1.5 degrees is slipping away from us. And just to illustrate that, the target of 1.5 degrees is shown in green on this thermometer. The Paris pledges so far only get us to about 3 degrees, or if the US really does pull out, 3.5. If we continue with business as usual, then we're getting towards 4 degrees by 2100. So we're way off where we need to be, and we need a sense of real urgency on everybody's part to meet these targets. So if I were to give you a lecture on astrophysics, the beginning of the universe, or black holes, or particle physics, then I would engage your curiosity. I would tap into that part of humanity which is always sort of overawed by the cosmos and so on. And I could give you, if I were good at it, I could inspire you, I could inform you, and as you leave the room, you would be emotionally and ideologically unchallenged. But the climate change story is different. And the irony is that the better that you tell it, the more likely you are to generate in your audience strong emotions of anxiety, fear, loss, grief, guilt, and in particular helplessness, which is a particularly damaging emotion to generate within people, or a feeling. And the psychologists and psychiatrists tell you that if you do that, you generate a feeling of cognitive dissonance, a feeling of unhappiness, which is a very powerful force. It's as powerful as being very hungry or very thirsty. And so if, as mea culpa, I and many of my colleagues have done, we deliver the story well, and you probably felt it in some of those earlier parts of the talk, we generate that feeling of cognitive dissonance, that feeling of unhappiness, particularly if we don't offer any way of dealing with the helplessness. And so when the audience leaves the room, we have charged them up so that they're prey to anybody who offers a way of relieving that unhappy feeling by saying, it's a natural cycle, it's the sun, it's always happened, there's nothing we can do about it, don't believe him, he's just out for fame, fortune and grants, and so on. And so that's the first lesson, that for anybody giving a talk, the first rule is understand your audience and understand what you're doing inside their heads. And unfortunately, the climate science community has tended not to do this very well. Not least because most natural scientists are extremely reluctant to step across a kind of red line that they see in front of them, which is the range where you begin to get into the realms of advocacy or activism, because scientists feel rightly that that can undermine their legitimacy and the belief that they're being genuinely impartial and weighing up all the evidence. So there are lots of reasons why the message that has gone out, particularly to the lay public, has generated these strong reactions. So that's one of the reasons why, if you, and you may have experienced this yourself, if you're at a dinner party or a gathering and somebody says to you, what do you do? If you say, I'm a climate scientist, they tend to look the other way and say, oh, the broccoli looks nice, doesn't it? You know, it kind of kills the conversation. Nobody really wants to talk about this because for everybody, climate scientists as well, there are very disturbing emotional reactions to this story because none of us feel that we have a grip on it, and that's a very uncomfortable feeling. This is a map, an animation of the daily traffic, air traffic in the over the world. 3,700 aeroplanes are in the sky as we speak. You see this animation run. This is the sort of daily traffic. And, you know, all of us get on airplanes. I was saying to somebody earlier that I have a colleague, an Australian colleague, who once a year flies to Sydney. And in his public lectures, he shows a picture of the carousel in Sydney Airport with his 23-kilogram suitcase on it. And the question he asks is, how many additional 23-kilogram suitcases should I pick up to carry away the CO2, the carbon dioxide, that I am responsible for in this flight from London to Sydney? Anybody got any ideas? Well, it's 126. So he shows a picture of the carousel with 126 suitcases on it, 127 because he's got his clothes as well. He says, that's my share. There are 400 other people on the aeroplane. Even to fly to Paris and back, it's 2.5 suitcases of CO2. So we all do this. And you know, you visit your conscience, you interrogate, you know, should I really do this flight? Is the net benefit? And so on. And often we just sort of go, do you know, I feel like going on this flight anyway. We all suffer from this, you know. And one of the problems with this issue is that it mustn't become a tyranny. We mustn't all start looking at each other and finger pointing because we're all in this carbon-intensive world. It was completely unwitting. It's made us all prosperous in ways that humanity has never experienced before. But now we know that there's a downside. And so it not only makes us unhappy because it makes us feel anxious and helpless, but it makes us feel guilty. It threatens deeply established practice and cherished lifestyles. It's really interesting. Talk to young people at the university, and of course they're very motivated to deal with this. And then suddenly you hit a red line because they say, oh yeah, we're going to Reykjavik for a big booze up this weekend. And you sort of say, really? And they say, don't you touch that. I deserve that. I've been working very hard. So it threatens deeply established practices and cherished lifestyles. So that's the second reason why it collides with humanity. But the third reason is much deeper and more profound and has proved to be probably the most difficult. And that is that by and large, humanity tends to divide into two broad groups. I know you can argue about this. I've used the US Democrat and Republican symbols here for reasons that just at random. But if you are a rugged individualist who values your right to own an assault rifle and you have a particular package of beliefs, it so happens, for reasons that are historical and interesting, but you can see that because regulation threatens neoliberalism, and neoliberalism tends to be more associated with republicanism and right-wingism than it does with the Democrats, although you know the distinction is complex. If you regard state interference as an anathema, and if you regard the United Nations as a sort of the devil incarnate, if you think that regulation stifles your rights as an individual, then again the cognitive dissonance of the evidence causes you to seek some way of denying that this is true. And so if somebody tells you it's a huge hoax perpetrated, I don't know, by the Chinese to wreck the American economy, or by scientists because they want fame and fortune, then you're very susceptible to believing that. If, on the other hand, you're somebody whose worldview and deep values, the things that are deep inside you, the same sort of thing that divides people in the UK on Brexit, if your deep values are set in a different direction, where you see that if you're interested in community, if you're interested in protecting the environment, if you value the environment and see yourself as having stewardship of it, a responsibility for it, rather than dominion over it, and we can talk a lot about how religions play into this thinking, then you will tend to see this as a threat. So this story instinctively, whether people are conscious of it or unconscious of it, it instinctively challenges strongly held values and powerful issues of identity. And all of this before you collide with vested interests who simply would prefer to maintain the status quo. So it's no surprise on this basis that this has proved to be a particularly contentious subject, especially when most people gather their information about the world from the media. Now, the internet is undermining that in a variety of ways. But when you see that the tabloid press of the UK has packaged together, just in the same way that it's a badge of honor in the United States as a Republican not to believe in climate change. If you're a Tea Party member, that's part of your package of views. But if you look at the impact that headline after headline after headline has on people, in this case on migration, so these are collages of the short statements that day by day by day by day are deliberately attempting to shape what goes on inside people's heads. Psychologists tell you that even if you completely disagree with a concept, an idea, if it is continued, if you're bombarded with it, it strengthens literally the connections inside your head that respond to that topic. So if you package climate fraud with the whole migration issue and so on, you can see why it is that there is a reluctance out there to address this. And you can see why it is. This is a diagram that one of my psychology colleagues in Norway actually has produced, why people build walls around themselves to protect themselves from this story. So they either negate it, they simply say, I don't believe it's true, and find reasons to justify that, or they disavow it, that is, that somewhere in their heads they accept that it's true, but they constantly avoid dealing with that. They actively go out and deny it, persuade other people that it's not true, or, as most of us do, we kind of evade the consequences. You know, we do get on an airplane with a slight feeling of guilt, maybe pay an indulgence to offset the carbon, but it leads to silence and lack of action. And so that's where the reluctance really comes from. So how do you deal with this? You know, what can you or I do? Well, so there are 3 Ps: personal, professional, and political. At the personal level, we can all make a statement that satisfies our own consciences and indeed sets a good example, if you like. So there are many examples of people who have been through processes, either individually or collectively, where they've very significantly reduced their carbon emissions or carbon footprint, sometimes by as much as a factor 2, and often come out of it saying, you know, I lead a healthier and more satisfying life as a result. But what we all know is that an individual is not going to change the world. The planet is indifferent to the fact that one tiny source has been reduced. What it cares about is the total set of emissions. So I'll jump to political. Interestingly, a few years ago, I would ask my public audiences, you know, how many of you, because most people who come are kind of on side, they want to know more. It's relatively rare that I get strong climate contrarians, although it's very interesting when I do. They tend to stand up and scream at me, which is fascinating. But I had a lady in Houston who looked like my mother stand up and start screaming at me. And as far as I could make out, she was telling me that it was she regarded it as her right as an American citizen to burn as much carbon as she felt like it. She had a 24-room house and she had left lights on it so it looked like an ocean liner when she came to my talk to make the point. So, you know, there's not much you can say about that, really. So on the political side, you know, I asked my audiences how many people have written to their MP recently expressing serious concern about this. And it's interesting, a colleague of mine yesterday said that one of his students has just written up her PhD and her on UK MPs' attitudes to climate change risks. And her conclusion is that they're fatalistic and paralysed, afraid of speaking out for being labelled as extreme by colleagues, and above all, unprompted to action by any electoral pressure. They say it is that messages from constituents expressing concern are rare. Now, they're less rare than they used to be, but they're still very rare. So we still just about live in a democratic country, some people might argue, but one can exercise one's right as a citizen to shift things. So, but what about professional? And here, it seems to me that the professional side, and that's why this audience is so important, has a power that individuals don't, because once you're part of an organization, that organization has processes, it has assets, it has structures, it has organizations that can be used to make a significant difference. So this image is from a number of years ago. It was when I was still director of the Science Museum, and Franny Armstrong, who came up with the 10-10 campaign, which was to get large organizations to reduce their carbon emissions by 10% in 2010 and then 10% each year subsequently, asked the Science Museum to be the first to sign up to sort of make a good start and encourage others to come along, which we did. Interestingly, when I went to talk to our services, building services people, I said, before I sign up, can we do 10%? And they kind of shook their heads and sucked their pencils and said, well, do you know, we just did 17% with a major refit of windows and so on. I don't really see how we can do another 10% in a year. So I talked about it with the chairman of the board of trustees, and I said, well, you know, they don't think we can do it. And he said, well, you know, why don't we just say we'll do it anyway? So we did. And I called the staff in and said, look, I've just committed us to something. We don't have a clue how we're going to do it. Have you got any ideas? And it was wonderful because it rallied the staff to something that they believed in, something that made them feel good. They came in with a spring in their step. I think we did 22% or something that year, which was not least by putting in a lot of solar at the old airfield that we own, or that the museum owns for its reserve collection, which is now pumping out huge amounts of electricity into the national grid. So that was a good story. You've all heard of the Marks and Spencer's Plan A. I heard Carmel McCade years ago give a fascinating talk where she explained that they persuaded the board to do something on the basis that Marks and Spencer sells, I think, 10,000 products, you know, from sweaters to pies. And they have each has a supply chain of up to 10 threads spreading globally. So at the time they were feeling floods in Bangkok and heat waves elsewhere and potato crop failures in Russia and so on. So the board was, and indeed the finance director, were easily persuaded that they should do an exercise to look at their vulnerability, their existing vulnerabilities, and see ways of making themselves more resilient. And then, of course, it was sensible to say, and while we're at it, maybe we should look at what's coming down the road over the next 10 or 20 years. And fascinatingly, they and others who are doing similar exercises said when we began to look forward and see how all the cost curves and threats began to tip upwards, sometimes exponentially, what had started out as an adaptation and resilience exercise turned back into a mitigation exercise. They're basically saying, do you know what? It would really be better not to go there if we can possibly avoid it. And then finally, and I should stop, I chair a thing called the London Climate Change Partnership. This is a partnership of the organisations that you might say are the kind of metabolism of London, everything from Transport for London through to the boroughs and the GLA, Lloyd's, the finance industry, the theatre and museums, the Met Office, Thames Water, and so on. And if we just take the issue of the London floodplain, 1.25 million residents, I think it's £250 billion worth of property value, and then you can read the rest. 35 tube stations, 51 railway stations. It only takes one overtopping of the embankment to wreck and damage that stuff. And so a huge effort was put in by the Environment Agency to generate their Thames Estuary 2100 plan, which, if up to £10 billion worth is spent, I think can be relied upon to protect the London floodplain up until 2100. We might come back to that. And what was fascinating about this, and what set it apart from previous attempts on these sort of large-scale projects, was that the people running it recognised that there would always be irreducible scientific uncertainties. Scientific uncertainty, you know, the fact that you don't quite know what the level of sea level rise will be in 20 years' time, can cause paralysis, where people are saying, well, let's wait another couple of years and maybe the scientists will come forward with something a little bit more precise. I actually ran an international program some years ago that started off with the tagline. It was a global change program. The tagline was reducing uncertainties. When I took it over after 10 years, we did a review and we quietly dropped the reducing uncertainties because we'd learned a lot, and we'd learned that things were a lot more complicated than people had originally thought, and actually the uncertainties went up. So what the people with the Thames Estuary 2100 plan is they took an adaptive pathways approach. They said, look, we're never going to know exactly what we're confronted with. So let's have lots of options that we have thought through, costed, planned out, and they're ready. And then let's wait until there are critical moments where we have to make a decision. We make the best decision we can at that moment, but we ensure that we are flexible, nimble, and fleet of foot, so that if we have been too optimistic, we can deal with it. If we've been too pessimistic, well, that probably doesn't matter because it'll be a good investment for the future anyway. And this is about the best you can do in terms of optimizing cost benefit on these huge, very expensive projects. So this shows a pathway through where you can deal with 1 meter of sea level rise, or 2 meters, or 3 meters, or 4 meters by mixing and matching and making choices from this pre-considered and planned set of options. And indeed, New York and Rotterdam and others saw this and thought this is a really brilliant way of addressing these issues that confront us. A similar approach is being taken now to heat risk in London, and we're trying to roll out this adaptive pathways approach across a number of other difficult issues. So that's it. Really, for the rest of the morning, or at least the rest of this session, it's kind of over to you. And thank you very much for listening.